Hi, I'm Stuart Malina, and today we'll be talking about the program that the Greenwich Symphony Orchestra will be presenting on November 12th and 13th, Saturday night at 7:30 and Sunday at 3 in the afternoon. Three very beautiful pieces on this program, the first of which might be, one of my top 10 most serene pieces in the entire repertoire. This is a piece by British composer Vaughan Williams, called Fantasia on a Theme by Tallis. It comes from 1910, but as the name of the piece indicates, it's based on music that was written a long time before that. Tallis was a Renaissance composer in Renaissance England. He was an important composer in that he and William Byrd, another Englishman, were really the leaders of English Renaissance music at the time. They basically ran the show. They had a virtual monopoly between the two of them. One of the things that Tallis contributed to was the Psalter of the time. These were settings of psalms for the new church in England. And one of these was discovered by Vaughan Williams when he himself was editing the English hymnal in the early part of the 20th century in 1906. This was a gargantuan task that Vaughan Williams took on, putting together the English hymnal, which became an incredibly influential piece of musicology. This became the hymns that people would sing in church, not just in England, but in many cases around the world. And Vaughan Williams took this on reluctantly, but eventually dove into it. And in so doing, discovered one of these psalm settings by Tallis. It was a psalm that was written in the Phrygian mode, which I'm not going to get into too much, but the Phrygian mode, if you think about the white keys on a piano, it would be the mode that begins on the E natural, so on this scale, which immediately has a little bit of an exotic feel. But the hymn itself has this melody. This psalm kind of bewitched Vaughan Williams, and a few years later in 1910, he wrote this Fantasia on a Theme by Tallis, and it became one of the pieces that defined him as a superstar in England at the early part of the 20th century. It was really kind of his breakthrough piece at the beginning of a very, very successful career as a British composer. So this piece is for strings only. But Vaughan Williams, for several reasons, divides the string orchestra into three distinct groups, the largest of which is your main string orchestra. Then he has a smaller orchestra too, a second orchestra, made up of just 4 violins, 2 violas, 2 cellos, and 1 double bass. Ideally, they sit separately from the main ensemble, and this allows for kind of an interplay of the large sound and the more intimate sound. And then he also has a solo quartet, so just 2 violins, a viola, and a cello that also have their own interplay with the other 2 ensembles. This gives Vaughan Williams an incredible amount of imaginative leeway to create a sound landscape for this piece. And it does very much evoke antiphonal church music, where you might have multiple choirs at different places in the church that sing in response to each other at different times. As I said before, it's a truly serene piece of music, and it begins extremely quietly and harmonically somewhat enigmatically. It begins on a G major chord, which then progresses to an F major chord, to a B flat chord, to an A flat chord, to a G flat chord. So right away, we don't really know what key we are in. After this very brief, very quiet introduction by the string orchestra, we have a D. And then he gives us a hint of Tallis's melody in pizzicato in the low instruments. that second part of what I played is a harmonization of the melody somewhat, but it's in a way that Thomas Tallis would have never harmonized a melody. It has parallel major chords, which was kind of the quintessential no-no in Renaissance counterpoint. And it creates this exotic sense of modernity in the music. Immediately after this short introduction, Vaughan Williams presents the original Thomas Tallis melody in the original way that Thomas Tallis himself harmonized it. What I find interesting about this original harmonization is the way it goes back and forth from G major to G minor. So going to a major chord, then back. Vaughan Williams will play around with that idea throughout this piece with major and minor chords, as well as similar harmonizations to those parallel major chords that we had earlier on in the introduction. This will go on for a while. It will build in richness. You'll have more interplay between the various orchestras. And then things get very quiet for a while, and we have a solo viola that plays a little bit of a variation on the second part of Tallis's melody. Now, the piece is called a Fantasia, and the idea of a Fantasia is kind of this free-form, almost stream of consciousness approach to composition. And so it makes sense that he's going to have various interplay of parts of the melody that become other melodies. So this is what this viola will sound like. This melody will come back again several times in this piece, but in this first time we hear it, it will become somewhat of a contrapuntal approach with just the solo string quartet. And you'll hear each instrument joining one at a time, creating a richer texture, but still very, very thin, to be then contrasted with the larger ensemble when they interrupt a little bit later on. I don't want to play too much of this because I want the piece to surprise you. And one of the things that I love about this piece is it does always have something new around the corner. At one point, you'll have a very romantic theme. Actually, I'm not going to play it for you. You'll have to come to the concert to hear it. But suddenly you find yourself, aha, yes, we are at the turn of the 20th century, back in this world of romanticism and harmonizations that are much more contemporary than what you would have had in 1567 when Tallis first wrote the melody for the Psalter. But I do think it's a beautiful way to open up this concert. On the one hand, it's a very intimate piece. On the other hand, it's a piece that really sucks you into this intimate world and fills your soul. It's a deeply spiritual piece of music, a deeply beautiful piece of music, and it really did solidify Vaughan Williams' place in the world at the time as one of the leading voices of composition in Britain and in Europe. The second piece on our program is by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the great prodigy composer of the late 18th century. This piece comes from 1786. It's one of his most popular pieces. It's the Piano Concerto number 23 in A major. Mozart wrote many piano concertos. Probably he played most of them himself, leading them from the keyboard. This is an absolutely delightful piece, and it's interesting to me that it comes at a very joyful part of his life. Not so much because it isn't filled with joy. The outer movements of this piece are extremely joyful and filled with great spirit. But the inner movement, the second movement, is extremely dolorous. And some people have described it as almost tragic, and somehow it must reflect some tragedy in Mozart's life. But this was a happy time in Mozart's life. It was around the time that he went back to writing opera, and opera was the great love of his compositional life. He was writing The Marriage of Figaro, which would be premiered just a few weeks after this concerto was, and then he would go on to write Don Giovanni. These were among his greatest successes. These were the times when he was feeling the most acclaim of his life. And so it's hard to believe that he was feeling anything but somewhat satisfied. And that is reflected certainly in the outer movements of this piece. So the idea of a concerto is interplay between a solo instrument and the orchestra. This comes from the Concerto Grosso of the Baroque period, which was really just any two groups, usually one smaller, one larger. But as you get into the classical period, and certainly later than that, a concerto really does indicate a soloist, or sometimes two soloists, who will be featured with a large orchestra. So it'll be a soloist and orchestra. And that was how Mozart wrote this piece. I'll talk just a little bit about form, because I think it's crucially important to understanding this concerto and pretty much any work of the 19th century. Sonata form, which you'll get in the first movement, and in the first movement of virtually every symphony of the classical period, every concerto of the classical period, can be thought of as kind of a thematic and harmonic journey that always returns home. And so the general form of sonata form is you have a first theme in the main key of the piece. So in this particular case, we're in A major. And then the first theme will continue on. It will depart from the key of A major and go to a related key. Usually, when you have a piece that's in a major key like A major, it will go to the fifth degree. So the second theme will be in E major, and you will end that first section, which is called the exposition, where he exposes the themes. So you have a first theme, a second theme in the related key. Then you have a development section where he takes ideas from the various themes that he's presented and works through them in a compositional way before returning after the development section to what's called a recapitulation, where he restates the themes. But this time, the second theme is in the original key. So instead of departing to E major, you have a return home to A major. Now, when you're dealing with concertos, this is slightly different. In a classical concerto like this one, written towards the end of the 18th century, generally the orchestra will first present an entire exposition of the themes that you're going to hear. So you'll hear your first theme, you'll hear your second theme, then the piano will come in, or the solo instrument will come in and repeat those themes and kind of start again and go through the progression of keys that we just talked about a moment ago. So in this particular case, I'll play a few of these themes. The opening theme that you'll hear in the orchestra is a very delightful one, presented by the strings. And so forth. It's truly lovely. I mean, one of the things that I love about Mozart is his melodies are so lyrical. It's often been said that when Mozart wrote music for any instrument, he was always writing opera. He was writing vocal music that just happened to be played by the instrument in question. So in this case, the piano's melody and the orchestra's melody at the very beginning is very lyrical. It's very singable. And so we have this, and it goes on for a while, and then we have a second theme. Now, at the very beginning, because the piano is going to be coming in again in A major, he doesn't go to E major, but rather for this opening orchestral exposition, he stays in A major. Again, delightful, beautiful. Yes, it contrasts to the opening theme, but it's very much of a piece. It doesn't feel out of place. It relates to the opening theme. It's just kind of a nice foil for it. So this will happen for a while. You'll hear both themes. You'll hear some of the transitional themes that he's going to present, and then he brings the piano in. I will talk a little bit about the opening of the piano because it brings into play kind of the defining accompaniment figure of the classical period of music. The idea of the classical period of music is you have melody and a harmonization of melody. That's kind of what it is that the music is based on. This is in contrast to the Baroque period of music, where it was very much about counterpoint, how various melodies would interplay with each other, and you would have a harmonization over just a figured bass, a single bass line that would be harmonized by a harpsichord or another, what we call a continuo instrument. So here, the harmonization of the piano is typical. It's called an Alberti bass, and it's basically taking a chord that you want harmonized and separating the notes so it creates an accompaniment figure. This is how it sounds with the piano. So the piano plays the basic theme that the orchestra played at the opening, but then immediately it starts doing little variations. This is typical for a concerto. The piano part wants to be a little bit more interesting than the simplicity that we heard at the very beginning. And then another variation. So I'm giving you all of this just to give you an idea that although we've heard the material already at the very beginning, when the piano does it the second time, already it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more pianistic. It's a little bit more virtuosic. There are going to be scales. There are going to be arpeggios to make it more interesting. Mozart wrote a lot of theme and variations. In addition to writing all the other works that he wrote. And it really showed his imagination in ways of taking simple melodies and making them a little bit more interesting. So this goes on for a while, and you'll hear both of the opening themes. And then there will be a development section. And in the development section, interestingly, he begins with a closing theme for the orchestra. So the piano has already finished its entire exposition. You get to the big moment where there's going to be a trill that sets up the end of the exposition. And then the orchestra comes in. And then we get this theme. So it's interesting, and this is not typical necessarily that at the beginning of the development you'll have a brand new theme. It happens every so often. Certainly as time goes on, Beethoven did this quite a lot and brought new themes in development sections, but this is already Mozart's being a little bit naughty in terms of sticking to form. We have our development section, which takes you into all kinds of different keys. We have a very swift progression of modulation of keys. And then our main theme will come back. The reason why I brought that second theme, that new development theme up, is that he chooses to end the movement with that theme as well. And that I think is very interesting. So before the piano will play its cadenza, again, you will have that that closing / development theme from the orchestra. And there is a cadenza. A cadenza, I suppose I should mention, is a moment where the orchestra stops. The orchestra has reached a moment setting up a chord that is not resolved. It is a chord on the 5th degree. Again, we're in A major, so the 5th degree is an E. And so this is what it sounds like. And then the piano is free to do what it wants for a while. I'm not sure what Rachel is going to play for this cadenza. She may do one of the standard cadenzas that's been written. Perhaps she's doing her own, but it's a chance for the pianist to also fantasize and improvise on the various themes that have been presented thus far. So this brings us now to the second movement. In my opinion, this is one of the more spectacular movements in all of Mozart. It's in the key of F sharp minor, and I am not aware of any other piece of music that Mozart wrote in the key of F sharp minor. It's a very haunting key, and it's very beautiful in the way that it works with A major. Generally, when you have a major key, it has a key signature. So A major has a C sharp, an F sharp, a G sharp in its scale, so 3 sharps. F sharp minor also has 3 sharps, and so it's called the relative minor. It's the minor that is a third below the key of your piece. So the piece is in A major, and now we're suddenly in F sharp minor. And he gives us an absolutely splendid melody. Slightly atypical. I mentioned before that Mozart's melodies were like melodies that would be sung in opera. But this one has a lot of leaps, and most vocal music doesn't have this kind of leap. Listen to this beautiful melody. The rhythm that this melody is in is the rhythm of a dance called a Sicilian dance, a dance in 6/8, 1, 3, 1, 3, 1, with this gentle rocking rhythm that goes on through it. I think it's beautiful, and I do want to talk about one small harmonic detail, and that's when you have... He goes to G major. Why is this so strange? Well, as I said, the scale of F sharp minor has a G sharp in it. And to go to G major is a sudden shift. Now, this is not uncommon. This is called the Neapolitan. The Neapolitan is just a half step above the fundamental key. So in F sharp minor, it's a G natural. And the way I like to think about what's happening here is we've been in F sharp minor for a while, and we're kind of in the F sharp minor world, and then suddenly the Neapolitan puts us someplace else. And then immediately he transitions back in. But that someplace else is a color change, it's an emotional change, and it immediately, early on in this piece, because it's in the very first phrase, sets up an emotional content to this particular section. So then we follow this opening. This opening is just in piano, solo piano, before the orchestra plays anything. And the orchestra comes in with a contrasting theme. Wow, I mean, I wish I had written that one melody. If I had written that one orchestral tutti, I feel like I would have done something very special. So what makes this so wrenching? The music actually kind of pulls at your heartstrings. Well, this is done, in my mind, one of the things that makes this effective is the use of what we call suspensions. Suspensions are a note that fits harmonically into what you hear when it is first played, but then the harmony underneath shifts and creates a dissonance that has to be resolved. So right away, this B natural in a C sharp chord fits in perfectly, but then it changes. And now it's a dissonance that has to resolve. And then the same idea here. The C sharp fits into an F sharp minor chord, but then the harmony changes. And the C has to resolve. And then you have the same with a D. And the D has to resolve. So you have this constant relaxation of consonance, creation of dissonance, and then relaxation back into consonance. It's extremely beautiful, and it's not unique to Mozart. I think probably the king of using this was Tchaikovsky. He knew how to take a melody, create these dissonances, and absolutely tear your heart apart. But anyway, I love this movement. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do think it's worth mentioning the second theme of this movement, which you hear in the orchestra. And, well, I'll play it for you. It's now in A major, which makes sense. We've been in F sharp minor. We move back to the relative major, which is the key of the overall piece. And it's as wrenching as the opening melody is. This melody is serene, absolutely beautiful, and feels completely in place in the world of Mozart opera. And in fact, Mozart will use this melody in his operatic writing. And again, it's just so lovely that we've had this opening, which is so deeply painful and wrenching. And it's almost like the clouds part and the sun shines through for this middle section. In fact, I see that the sun is shining through my window, creating this swath of light. How appropriate is that? So we now move very briefly to the last movement. The last movement again begins with just the piano playing, and this is a rondo movement. In brief, the word rondo comes from the same Latin root as the word round does in English. And just as you have a round circle, if you start in point A and you go someplace else, it eventually is always going to come back to point A. So in a rondo, you're given a theme. That's our point A. Then you have some kind of other theme that takes you away. Then it comes back to our theme. Then another theme takes you away, then it comes back to our theme, and then et cetera, et cetera. And rondos can have any number of other themes, but it will always come back to your main rondo theme. In this particular case, it's also somewhat sonata form. You have our theme, and then you have a second theme, and then the main theme will come back, and you have a development theme, and then et cetera. So it kind of mocks the form of a sonata form, but it really is still a rondo. So here's our rondo theme. And then this is immediately followed by a big exposition for the orchestra, much like the opening of the piece, but having already heard the rondo theme, it will now take us through a whole bunch of iterations of that theme and a few transitional themes. Then we will get our first contrasting theme. And we'll stay in that world for a little while. It'll interplay with the orchestra, a little bit of virtuosic playing in the piano, and then we return to our rondo theme. Then we will have yet another theme. Now this is somewhat of like a development theme. And the development theme is very dramatic. And et cetera, et cetera. So you have this F sharp minor back like the second movement, our relative minor for this next theme. Then we will have our rondo theme again. Then for the next contrasting theme, because this is a rondo sonata form, it's going to be our original contrasting theme, kind of like a second theme in the recapitulation. I hope this all makes sense. I know it's a lot of terms that some of you have never heard before, but the basic idea is he's using form. So in the first movement, he's using a sonata form, a first theme, a second theme, a development section, and then a return to those themes. In the last movement, he's using a rondo form. You have a main theme, a contrasting theme, and the main theme comes back, another contrasting theme, the main theme comes back, another, et cetera, et cetera. Mozart and the entire classical period was very much about form. I think what defines great composers is how they work within the world of rules and how they break the rules occasionally. But when it came to form, Mozart was pretty much playing by the rules of the game. What was creative about Mozart was the way that he created harmony and melody in ways that no one had before, and the way that he created contrast, the way that he orchestrated, the way he used instruments of the orchestra. All of this will be very clear in this very, very beautiful piano concerto. The final piece on our program, and the piece that will take up the entire second half of our program, is Brahms' Spectacular Symphony No. 2 in D major. This was a piece that was written in 1877. It took him just a summer to write this symphony, which is remarkable, given that the first symphony took him nearly 20 years. Now, some of this is because he was feeling intimidated to write his first symphony. It was clear that people were seeing him as the heir apparent to Beethoven in terms of symphonic writing. And he took this very seriously and waited a long time to present his first symphony because he felt that the stakes were very high and he had a lot to lose, and wanted to write a piece that was worthy to follow the 9 symphonies of Beethoven, and particularly the 9th symphony. For the second symphony, it came much quicker. It's as wonderful a piece. This is all 4 of Brahms' symphonies are masterpieces. In fact, Brahms didn't allow anything that he wrote not to be a masterpiece. If he deemed that it wasn't a masterpiece, he literally crumpled it up and threw it in the fire. So there were many pieces that he wrote that no one will ever see because he didn't want them to represent his output. He was a perfectionist, and you see this in his music. It's so beautifully structured. The melodies are so perfectly formed. The harmonies are so organic in the way that they flow from one another. Each of his 4 symphonies has its own emotional feeling to it, kind of its own ethos. The first movement is extremely stormy and extremely majestic. The second one that we're going to play is pastoral, joyful, lyrical. The third one is the most introspective of the symphonies, and the last, again, returns to the world of intensity of emotion, and ends extremely dramatically, boldly, and powerfully. But again, to return to the second symphony, right away at the very beginning, you know you're in a different world from the first symphony. The first symphony begins literally with a bang. It's the timpani banging out C's, etc. This begins on the opposite end of the spectrum, extremely quietly, with 3 notes in the double bass and cellos, introducing a melody that you'll hear in the horns and the woodwinds. extremely serene, extremely joyful. D major, very happy key, nothing stormy at all in this opening. What I'd like to do is take this opening melody apart a little bit in terms of its musical components to see how Brahms will use these components to create the music that will come afterwards, because I think it's something that most good composers do, whether they do it intentionally or not. But the things that make a piece hold together are that everything seems to follow seamlessly from what came before, but nobody did this better than Brahms. And so you begin with what we call a neighbor tone, D, C sharp, back to D, and then that progresses to the fifth degree. But remember, that neighboring tone you're going to hear a lot in this piece. Then we have this progression of arpeggios. Ending with, which has kind of the opposite contour of one goes down, the other one comes up. And then the answer in the woodwinds remember this scale, so 4 notes. And then we have, similar to what the horns had before, to bring this melody to a close. So again, you have the neighboring tones, you've got the arpeggiated thirds, and then you have our little scale. So when the first real theme comes in the violins in a little bit, this is what it sounds like. So what is this made up of? Neighboring tone, arpeggio, like we had earlier, and then a descending 4 note. Instead of, we have. So again, listen to this melody again and see if you can recognize the elements from our opening section. This is just to show how Brahms intentionally changes things slightly, but stays within the same world of musical contour, musical composition, to create melodies that seem to fit very beautifully together. The other thing from this opening that I'd like to mention a little bit is this, there's a long descending broken arpeggio that comes out of the opening. And so I'll play a little of it. So what makes this unique? Well, what makes it unique to me is that suddenly we lose any sense of meter. In the opening, we're very much in a sense of 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But when we get to this descending thing, yes, it's notated in 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But it doesn't sound like it's in 3. It sounds like it's in 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is, again, fairly typical of Brahms, where he writes music where you kind of lose track of where you are in the main rhythmic thrust of the piece, always to bring it back. But that bringing back almost feels like a homecoming, like we talked about earlier. That there's a sense of, we're back on comfortable ground, but for a while we've been somewhat at sea rhythmically. So this continues on. We have many different iterations of this opening theme, and then we get to a second theme. The second theme is set up by a little section which sounds like this. Why do I play you this? Because again, he's using that opening. Neighboring tone. And then he does it again. Neighboring tone. So. Again, he's playing around with the motive, but still very much staying within it. So the second theme is based around thirds. And we had thirds before. It's all harmonized in thirds. And so when we have the second theme, it doesn't feel out of place at all. He brings us to F sharp minor, which is interesting because in a piece in D, we would normally go to A major, or if we wanted to do the relative minor, it would go to B minor. But no, he goes to F sharp minor, which is interesting, but not, we're in the late 19th century now. Harmony has advanced tremendously since Mozart. But what is interesting is that he uses similar motives again from the beginning. We had at the beginning, and now we have, again, the reverse coming down. Anyway, I hope you get the picture, that he's creating variation, brand new theme. You hear the theme, it's not like, oh, that sounds like the opening theme, but if you break it up, you find it's made out of a lot of the same elements. For a closing section, you have music that sounds like this. Etc. So here, again, we had at the very beginning, and now he's doing it much quicker. But the same neighboring tone, just creating music that's very, very different. So anyway, so I think that's enough about the first movement. Actually, one other thing I would like to mention about the first movement, and that's the idea of hemiola. When music is in three, it leaves open a whole bunch of possibilities. And the possibilities are rhythmic. So if you have two measures in three, you have 6 beats. Most of the time, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But you could also take 2 measures and break it up into 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and have 3 pulses of 2. That's called hemiola. The other thing you can do with a measure that's in 3, it has 3 big beats, is you could be playing 1 and 2 and 3 end, or you could do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So for example, the short transitional theme that I gave you before is notated 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But the way it really is sounding is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Do you see what I'm talking about? So he's taking a 3/4 measure with 3 quarter notes and creating 2 pulses of 3 smaller eighth notes. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, rather than 1 and 2 and 3 end. And of course, the thing that all of us know when I'm demonstrating hemiola is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. That's a more contemporary use of hemiola. But the reason I bring this up is not just for that transitional theme. You're actually going to get this throughout this first movement. My teacher, Otto Werner Müller, used to say in a very thick German accent, Brahms was born in the hemiola hospital. Meaning that whenever Brahms had an opportunity to do hemiola, you can be pretty sure that he would. And when you have a piece that's written in 3/4, like this first movement, it's a fairly sure bet that there's going to be a lot of hemiola throughout this movement. So in the second movement, Brahms takes us to B major. This is a fairly bold harmonic move, even for late in the 19th century. Generally, a second movement would be on the fifth note of the scale of the opening movement, or it might be in the relative minor, sometimes on the fourth. But this one, we're in D major. It's now going to the sixth degree of D major to B major. Just suffice it to say, it's harmonically a big departure. This movement begins with a gorgeous melody presented by the cello section. And it begins somewhat with a similar contour of what we had presented in the first movement, that descending, we had, or in the other direction. But this time he goes in the descending direction and extends it just a little bit to a very expressive note. And then he continues again using that descending scale contour, but now with a little bit of a variation. On. This is all, again, cello section solo, extremely emotional, kind of a different world of emotion from the first movement, which had this sense of pastoral feeling, of joy. This is now much more intense, using this tenor voice of the cellos, and it's a much darker world that we have, and a much more overtly emotional world. I'm going to play How It Continues On because it's interesting what he does harmonically. It's also a very beautiful melody. But the other thing I want you to listen to in this melody is, again, he loses a sense of pulse. Now the pulses come on the offbeats, and suddenly they begin to feel like the pulses themselves. So where are we in terms of our feeling of 4? We really don't know. He will eventually resolve it. So coming from where we ended, so did you hear it kind of shifted from the offbeats to feeling like that was what the beats were, and then it returned. But most interestingly to me, and you might not have been able to hear this, but the end of this phrase is back in D major, which was the key of our first movement. And so he's kind of taken this journey from B major, ending in D major, only to start right again back in B major. He doesn't stay in D major long, but he's reminding us these are not unrelated as you might have thought. We can legitimately get to D major, and it brings back kind of, some kind of emotional connection to that first movement. This movement I don't want to spend a lot of time on because there's a lot to talk about if I wanted, and also it plays out so beautifully in the moment that I don't want to spoil any of that for the first time listener. But this is a piece that takes you kind of on its own internal journey. It's a complete work, the second movement. It takes you into extremely intense moments, into much serener moments of great joy, again, where the light seems to be shining through and all is well in the world. But overall, it's just a truly spectacular romantic piece of music. And when I say romantic, I mean in the sense of presenting emotion. This is a deeply emotional piece of music that Brahms has created. This is in contrast to the third movement. Now, the third movement is kind of in three different sections. All of them are related to each other. It begins with a simple melody in 3. It's very simple melody. You hear it first in the oboe, harmonized by clarinets and bassoons, with simple pizzicato accompaniment, plucked strings in the cellos. Again, it has similar contour to that opening, but now it has a neighboring note up. And so again, it's all of a piece. It's different, and yet it's similar enough that it makes sense in this piece. The last thing that I'll mention about this opening is that we're in the key of G major. So it seems like he's progressing down by thirds. We had D major, B major, G major. It doesn't sound crazy, but it's very much a departure from what most symphonists were doing at the time in terms of key relationships. So again, we now move on to the first contrasting section, but he takes the same idea. And now he just turns it into a much faster dance. So instead of, it's same material, same harmonization, but just much faster. And so this continues on into a kind of a joyful romp. That comes out of that. And now we're in C major, which is kind of fun. Again, a departure from D major. And then eventually it will return to our opening theme, and we get the opening theme again. The third section is a variation on. Now we're in a dance, though. He puts it into a 3 meter, and we have. Which is very interesting to me. So he's giving us a variation of the opening theme that then, that fast variation enters into this joyful dance-like part. And then the second contrasting theme is a variation on that joyful dance. He then brings it back at the end to the original theme, adding a little bit of dolorous counter melody. This is a very petite movement compared to the rest of the symphony. It's very short. It would be normally a scherzo, this third movement, meaning something a little bit more jolly and joking. And in that sense, it does very much fit the bill. But in my mind, it's much more an escape from the melancholy of the second movement, a little bit of an amuse-bouche, perhaps, something to kind of clear the palate before we have the bombast and excitement of the final movement. And so we get to the final movement, and it begins with a melody for the entire string section, but it's just a melody when we start. It'll eventually get harmonized, but again, what do we have? We have that opening neighboring tone. And so again, he's created yet another melody that reminds us of how we started this piece. So the piece stays quiet for a while. It's somewhat of a mysterious opening to the last movement. Joyful, yes. It's certainly happy, certainly has a lot of sparkle to it, but it's very understated, very quiet, and it will eventually get. Where are we? And then suddenly. It explodes into a big, loud, exciting, full orchestra statement of this opening theme fully realized. Here too we get a second theme, and in a sense it reminds me of the first movement in that we had the second theme was something for kind of middle voices of the string section. Here again it's first presented in the strings. And so forth. Rather majestic, rather expansive compared to the frenetic energy of the first theme. It all works itself out, of course, in the end. And the end of the Second Symphony, the end of this final movement, is one of exuberant joy, with the whole orchestra kind of crashing to this magnificent finish. A piece that started so serenely, that ends so bombastically. It's truly a marvelous piece of work. I hope you've enjoyed this very brief discussion of this program, and I hope we will see you all there. Again, it is the weekend of the 12th and 13th, I believe, of November at the Performing Arts Center at Greenwich High School, 7:30 on Saturday night and 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday. It should be a wonderful concert, and again, I am very excited to see you there.